So we're going to start our ceiling strut install. We're actually going to start this outside of the van because we want to kind of pre-assemble a few of the pieces. So we're going to have 11 pieces in total, I believe. So you're going to have 4 that correspond to your TXC1s, and then you're going to have 2 TXC2s. These 6 pieces are going to make up your main ceiling struts. And then you're also going to have some smaller components, 2 TC3s, 2 TC4s, and then a TC5. We'll kind of move on to those in a minute. So the first thing we want to do is actually pre-attach our track to the TXC1 and TXC2. And in order to do that, we need to place these little inserts into our TXC1. So basically, there's pre-drilled holes in these main larger components, and then there's PEM nuts in the smaller inserts. So you're just going to line those up by placing this underneath. And then we'll thread our track bolts in, and that'll connect the 2 pieces. I'm going to do that on both of these here. And these middle components, these are going to go around our ceiling ribs. You do want to be careful because these thicker sections are pretty heavy, so it's easy to bend those inner pieces. That's another benefit of putting the track on first. It kind of keeps everything sturdy. Okay, so now that I have those lined up, you're going to have 2 pieces of track labeled TXC1. So I'm going to line those up with my PEM nuts here, and then thread all of those in with my 30mm M6 bolts. We use the slightly longer bolts in the ceiling because it gives you a little bit more room to play with when you're putting your panels up. Okay, so now that we have all of our bolts tightened down on our TXC1s, we can move on to TXC2. The TXC2 track is actually going to bridge the gap between the TXC1 and the TXC2 speed strut pieces. So you want the pieces with the little tabs facing inward towards each other. So I'm just going to scoot those in until they're touching here. And then you can lay your track pieces down. All the holes in the track should line up with the PEM nuts preset in these speed strut pieces. So once those are set on there, you can take your bolts again and then secure all these down as well. One thing to note that I didn't mention earlier is you want to make sure to be using a T-handle for this. Don't use a power tool or anything like that for any of your L-track throughout the van. It can make the bolts seize and just cause issues down the line, so it's better to just hand tighten them. Okay, so now that we have our TXC2s attached, we'll have 2 solid struts now out of those 6 pieces. So the next step I'm going to do is take some blue painter's tape and basically just tape off these sections. We're going to be using some tools to hold them up in the ceiling, and that's just going to protect your track, especially if you have black anodized track. You want to keep it from scratching up while you're working. So I've pre-ripped some pieces here, and I'm just going to place it over. You don't want to wrap it because then you won't be able to get it off once it's in place, but just place it over where you're going to have your tool. I usually do a couple layers per section, and you only need to do it where you have these little tabs, if that makes sense. That's what's going to go around your ribs. Okay, so now that we have tape on all those sections, the last thing I'm going to do with these pieces before we can bring them into the van is loosen these 10mm bolts so that all of these little tabs, loosening them is just going to allow us to move them freely, and we'll tighten them back up once we're in the van. But doing it now is just a little easier on the table. So now that we've got our ceiling struts all prepped and ready to go, we're going to go into the van and measure the true center so we can make sure that they're going to be perpendicular when we mount them. Okay, so the first thing we want to do before installing any of the ceiling reinforcement is to actually measure our true center of the van. These ribs can kind of drift back and forth, so you don't want to rely on the factory holes. A good rule of thumb is these pieces on the outer edges that capture the main ceiling rib are going to stay where they are. So you can measure from one edge of this to the edge of here, and then divide by 2, and that's going to give you your true center. So I'm going to do that on all of my ceiling ribs and make a little mark just with a Sharpie or whatever you have to just mark that true center, and then we'll be able to line up our A-frame with that later. I'm going to do this one first. It's a good idea too to kind of help the measuring tape form with the rib so that you're getting a more accurate measurement here. So this is about 44.5, so I'm going to make a mark at 22.25. So now that we have our true center marked on all of our ribs, we're going to get our TC3 pieces. These are going to be your cross supports. They're also going to provide us with a guide to line up our speed struts. So these have a little Adventure Wagon logo, and there's going to be a line right through the top of the kind of A of the logo, and you want to put that right on top of the center mark you just made. So I'm going to line these up, and they go on ceiling 2 and 4. So if you have this kind of middle fan location, it's going to be right to the forward of that. So I'm going to set it up in place here and line it up with that line. And then we're not going to totally set this. I'm just going to put in a few set screws to hold it in place. And then we're going to mark out behind these PEM nuts and drill out if we need to. Because we're going to thread track through this, so we don't want it to be hitting anything behind there. So I'm going to go ahead and set these with some set screws, mark off behind my PEM nuts, and then drill all that out. Okay, so now that that's held up there, I like to just double check my distance from the end of this to the edge of this, just to make sure I'm still centered. Still looking good there. So now I'm going to take just a rivet or a punch or something like that and just mark out behind all of these PEM nuts. Some of them might be totally fine with factory holes, but we just want to make sure. Okay, so now I'm just going to take down this piece. There's just one on this one that I need to drill out, and then we can reinstall it and set our 3/16 rivets. So now that I've drilled out that one hole, I'm going to deburr it, put some rust preventative, and then put my piece back up in place. There's a couple set screws on the face of it that you can use for this step. You can use it for the other one as well. But just so you don't have set screws in the way as you're trying to set all your rivets, they're on the face. We don't actually use those. We can take those out when we're all done. Okay, so I've got my piece reinstalled with the 2 set screws right on the face of it. So now I'm going to go through and set my 3/16 rivets. I'm going to start in the middle and move my way out because you want this piece to be sitting flush with the rib. And usually it's just a little bit easier to start with the middle since you have it attached here. So I'm going to go through and do that, and then we'll move on to rib 2. So now that we've got the TC3 set on rib 4, we're going to move on to rib number 2 here and do the same exact thing. So we're going to set that, and then we'll move on to adding our tracks and then our speed struts. Okay, so we're going to move back to rib 2. So we've set the cross bracer in rib 4, and so we're just going to move back to the second one here. It's going to go in exactly the same. So I've measured my true center and marked it on my ceiling rib here. I'm going to line that little line up in the logo with that. And then, so once that's up there, you can even see by just kind of tucking your head underneath, or you can use a pin like we did in the other one, which of these PEM nuts is going to need to be opened up behind. So I can see these kind of center ones here on either side are going to need to be opened up a little bit. So I'm going to take this back down, take my step bit, open that up, and then put this back up in place with some set screws. Okay, so now that I have my piece set up there with some set screws, I'm just going to double check that I'm centered by measuring from the end of this to the little flange here on either side and make sure they're the same. Okay, looking good. So now I'm going to drill out my 3/16 holes on all these little tabs and set my rivets, and then we'll be all set and in place, and then after that we're going to install our track for both this piece and the forward one we did before. So for this forward cross support, I got my track up and realized that I forgot to take my set screws out. You definitely need to take those out. They're going to get in the way of your panels fitting underneath your L track. So I took it down. I'm going to take these out, rust prevent, and then remount my L track. Okay, so now that we've got the L track up on our cross supports, it's time to move into our actual speed struts. So you're going to need a few new tools for this. You're going to want your 1/4 inch drill bit, as well as your 1/4 inch pop rivets, your rust preventative still, and then you're going to want these 2 placement tools that came in your kit. This is going to help us hold the speed struts up while we kind of get all of our rivets set and everything kind of locked in. An extra person is also really helpful at this point. The speed struts are pretty heavy and kind of bulky to get around, so if you have a friend or something that can help you hold everything up there while you get it set, it's really helpful. Okay, so we're going to move on to our speed struts. I brought both the speed struts into the van, and then I also have my coworker Jackson here who's going to help out. It's easier with 2 people to kind of hold the speed strut up and get it locked into place. One thing we did first was there's a factory harness that goes around this D-pillar. We went ahead and popped all the clips to get that out of the way so it's not preventing us from lifting our speed strut all the way up into place. Both of us also have one of these placement tools This is going to allow us to basically fit into these factory holes here. You lift this little collar up and it allows you to swing out like this. We're actually going to use this second rib from the back, and you lock it in to the holes like that, drop the guard, and then it'll hold the speed strut in place. And that'll allow us to set our rivets and everything without having someone hold the speed struts while we're working. What we did here, which might have been kind of hard to see, is we're using these cross supports as placers. So you want this L-track on the speed strut to butt up with your cross L-track here on both this center one and our forward one as well. And then we're going to go ahead and drill all of our 1/4 inch rivets, and then to do that we loosened these little tabs earlier, so that allows us to push these little brackets into the ribs themselves. While you're doing this, you might want to have someone push up on this, make sure it's firmly in place while you're doing that, and we'll kind of go through and set all those. Okay, so I'm going to start at this center piece that's next to our cross support. I've already checked to make sure that our forward piece is flush. The L-track is just like this one is here. And so before I start drilling my holes, I'm just going to press this up into place and then move these little tabs forward and tighten these bolts down to keep it nice and tight in there. Okay, so now that we've got our speed strut up in place, the next thing you're going to want to check is our very forward support here, this little tab. This one does not adjust. So we want to make sure to favor the speed strut back. So you want these to be flush with the actual rib of the van when you have it pushed up into place. And you want these two pieces of L-track to be flush as well. So when you hold it up there, you can kind of see there's a little bit of a gap, but so we can scoot it over just a tiny bit. But you want to be able, these rivets to be able to place and make contact with the metal of the van. Okay, so now that we've got our first pop rivet set on the other side, I'm going to go ahead and push these tabs forward, tighten these bolts. And I like to do my pop rivets in like a crisscross pattern. So I did this one first, and then I'll come over to this side and do this one, and then back to the other side and back here. Okay, so now that we have our forward section set, we're going to move back to this cross section here and set this one. Having the forward and this one's going to lock everything in line, and then after we have these, we can kind of just run down the line and do everything really quick. So I'm going to hold this up in place and then push these little tabs so that they're flush with the ceiling rib, tighten them down, and then we're going to set our rivets here. Okay, so now we have our connection points set with rivets where the cross pieces are, here in the center and at the forward section. We can go ahead and go through and set all the rest of our rivets. I'm still going to move in that cross pattern to make sure that the strut is nice and even up against the rib. But those two sections being set is going to keep everything nice and parallel moving forward, so you don't have to worry about like measuring from your center or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and move into that, and then we can move into the other side. Okay, so when setting your speed struts, you want to set all of your rivets up to this last ceiling rib. So we're not going to set this one or our very aft connections either. So we're waiting on that because we want to put in this TX5 piece. If you set the rivets first, there's a chance that this isn't going to fit between your ceiling struts. So we're going to leave those disconnected. So there's a little bit of play on either side, and then we're just going to set this into place and then clamp it up there. It's going to be a pretty tight fit. And there's going to be 2 holes on either side of your speed struts that are going to line up with the 2 holes in this TXC5. Okay, so once we have those all lined up, these are actually going to be 3/16 pop rivets. So we're going to go ahead and set those, and then we can move on to setting our 1/4 inch for the rest of the speed struts. Okay, so I went ahead and set both my rivets just inside the holes. It's just going to keep anything from shifting around while I'm setting my first one. Okay. Okay, so now that we have this TXC5 set, we can go ahead and set the rest of our 1/4 inch rivets and our actual speed struts, and then we'll move on to our TXC4 pieces. Okay, so now that we finished with TXC5, we're gonna go to TXC4. These are gonna be our last pieces of A-frame. You should have 2 of these little orange brackets labeled TXC or TC4. And then they're gonna go on 2 different ribs. So the first one is gonna be this first one from the back, basically, or your 6th one from the front. Yeah, your 6th one from the front. And then the second one's gonna go on your 3rd rib, but we'll move to that one in a second. So basically there's this little notch out of it on here, and this is going to line up with the 0 line we measured earlier on, or not your 0 line, your true center, I mean, that we measured. I went ahead and re-measured once I had my ceiling struts placed to make sure that I was on center with those, and then I had to move my line to the other end of the rib so that it would line up with this little notch. But basically you want the little basically you want to be able to read TC4, so that should be facing you. And then I'm going to line that up with the little score I just made. And then you can either use some set screws or a clamp to keep this in place. And then we're going to use some 3/16 rivets to actually attach it. Okay, so we're on to our second TC4 piece. So this is on our 3rd rib. And the little tab is facing forward, the part that's flush on the ceiling rib itself. And the rivets that you're going to be drilling are facing the aft of the van. So I'm going to go ahead and drill out those 4 3/16 holes and set my rivets. Okay, so now that our ceiling bracers are complete, we're totally done with the A-frame. So at this point, I like to do a really good clean out of all the metal shavings, get all those out of the way because we're pretty much done drilling into the van. And then after this, we're going to move into electrical.